There are a few different ways to create a new scenario. If I go ahead and open up the main menu and click on My Scenarios, from this page, I can click on Create Scenario from the toolbar at the top to get to this window, where I can enter the details for my scenario. So I do this if I wanted to create a scenario from the top of the organization. The other way of doing this is to start from my org chart, and I do this if I wanted to use a subset of my data, such as all the positions under a specific manager. I recommend creating scenarios using only the data that you'll be working with, to make sure that you don't accidentally change something in other structures, and to avoid encountering disk space issues. So I'll go ahead into my org chart by clicking on the main menu, then on Charts, then on Position Reporting Structure. For this example, let's say that this organization is looking into reducing headcount in its sales team. In my org chart, I'll navigate to the position node for Senior VP of Sales. And from its node menu, I'll click on Create Scenario. As you can see, the same window as the one I got from the My Scenarios page appears. Only now, the scenario data is set for all the positions from the Senior VP of Sales. I can always change this data set before creating the scenario, but for my example, this is what I'll stick with. I'll also enter in a name for the scenario, so Sales Org Design Demo, and my type will be Org Design. Next, we have the default work area checkbox. A work area is a part of a scenario, or a subset of nodes in the scenario's org chart that are assigned to a specific user for them to manage components within it. Enabling the default work area checkbox defines your scenario data as a single work area assigned to yourself, and you can then assign other work areas within it to other users as needed. It's important to note that using this functionality isn't possible if you're creating a scenario from your entire dataset, as it may contain multiple routes, and in your scenarios you can only assign work areas that have a single root. So I'll just go ahead and enable the checkbox, since I'll be working with the data from the Senior VP of Sales. The last two fields are the key date and description. The key date is the date on which you want your scenario to become active. When you create a scenario, you won't be working with live data, but with a snapshot of what the solution predicts your data will be on a specific date, the key date. This is usually the day on which you expect your scenario to go live. What the key date field does is it tells the application what date to base the scenario's dataset on. From this window, I can select a new date if needed, and I can change it later on as well. A quick thing to note here is that if you create an empty scenario, you won't have the option to select a key date, as the application won't be pulling any organizational data into it. And finally, the description field here is optional, but can be very useful to help distinguish between entries on the My Scenarios page. Once I enter in all the information that I need in this window, I can click on Create, wait for the scenario to be created, and my scenario now appears on the My Scenarios page with the status set as In Progress. As you can see here, on the right side of the page, my newly created scenario has its own context menu, and from it, I can copy or delete it. And the third option I have loads the scenario's management page, which I can also do by clicking directly on the entry on the list. This is where I'll be performing most of the tasks related to my scenario. So on this page, we have the scenario properties, which lists all the important information we saw on the My Scenarios page, as well as a few more items I'll get into later. The big section in the center of the page is split into two tabs: Overview and Targets. From these tabs, I can edit the scenario's name and description, and I'll do that by clicking on the Edit buttons on the right, Add Objectives and Targets, and Manage Work Areas. So before we get into anything else, I'll just take a minute to delve a little deeper into objectives and targets, just to make sure there's no confusion. So in Nakisa Hanelly, objectives are goals that you set for your scenario, and these are typically qualitative information. So what we'll have in this section, if I click on the Add Objective button here, is a field where I can enter text. It's important to note that objectives are not measured, and that's what the targets are for. So targets are quantitative measures that you add to your scenario to verify that you're meeting your goals. So for this example, I'll just go into the Targets tab and click on the Create Target button. Continuing with my example, let's say that this organization is reducing headcount in sales. So the target could be set to decrease the headcount in sales by 15 to 20%. Similar to targets in the orgchart analytics, which I cover in a separate capsule, scenario targets are also set across a range, with a lower bound and an upper bound as you see here, and color-coded visual indicators to keep track of progress. I also have the option to add filters to this target from the drop-down list here. And of course, I need to give this target a name before I can create it. Once my target is created, it appears on the Target tab of the Scenario Management page, as you can see here. And from the context menu on the right, I have the option to edit or delete it. Within the work areas on my overview page, I'll be able to see the values associated to each target as well. So here I can see what the current value for headcount is, and what it should be to fall within the target's range. Before we move on, one last thing to note is that you have the option to import targets as well, by clicking on the Import Target button here. For more details on this, feel free to check out the latest Nakisa Hanelly user guide. So next, let's take a closer look at the Actions menu of the Scenario Management page. What I want to draw your attention to for now are the Find Routes, Share Scenario, and Change Key Date items. The Find Routes action will go into your dataset and identify all routes, so the topmost node of any network of nodes. In this case, since I created my scenario from a specific position node, my root node is the Senior VP of Sales, and it's the only one that appears on this list. But if I had used my entire dataset, the Find Routes action would also locate orphan nodes, so nodes that are not connected to the rest of your org chart, and they would appear here as well. So next in the Actions menu, we have the Share Scenario action. Clicking on this opens up a window where I can select users I want to share this scenario with, and I can search for them, either by employee or by role. I'll also need to choose their access level, and it's important to note that by giving someone full access, they'll have the same control and access that you do as the creator. Then I'll click on Add. Their name appears below. And of course, I'll click on Confirm once all that is said to share the scenario. If we look at the scenario properties, we can now see the new user that the scenario has been shared with. So let's go back into the Actions menu and jump ahead to the Change Key Date item. Just to quickly go over this, as I mentioned earlier, you have the option to change your scenario's key date after it's been created. From this page, you would simply click on the Select New Key Date button. Select one on the calendar. Click on Prepare New Report, then click on Confirm. The solution will perform a sync to identify any changes between your scenario's dataset and your source data for the new key date and prepare a summary of these changes. Once that's done, if we go back to the Scenario Management page, as you can see, the new key date appears under the scenario properties. And if the application detected any changes in your source data that have caused conflicts, you would have to manually resolve the changes. But as you can see here on the key date page, no data needed to be synced for this example. So earlier, I pointed out these two sections here on the Overview tab of the Scenario Management page, where I can manage work areas. And as you can see, those assigned to me would appear here, and those assigned by me to other users would appear at the bottom. In both cases, a user would only see work areas in either of these sections if they have some role within them. Right now, since I enabled the default work area checkbox when I created this scenario, I already have a work area in this section. If I hadn't enabled that checkbox, this section would be empty right now. Because of my role within this scenario, I can also assign this work area, so Senior VP of Sales, to other users by opening the context menu over here and clicking on Assign Work Area. The window that opens is very similar to the one that we saw for sharing a scenario, only now it'll assign a work area to the selected users. So for this example, I'll just go ahead and search for Roberto Pilson, the Senior VP of Sales and manager of this organization, and give him full access, which gives him read and write access to all objects in the work area and their secured data. Then I'll click on Add. And if I needed to, I could also add other users with read-only and restricted access. And hovering over the information icon here would give more details about what each access level is for. Once I click on Confirm, the changes are applied. And as you can see, this work area now has Roberto as an owner as well. So that's one of the ways of assigning a work area to users from the scenario management page. But what if I didn't have any work areas on this page yet? In that case, from the Actions menu, I could click on Find Routes, open the context menu of the route that contains the work area I'm looking for. In this case, I only have one route, and I would click on View in orgchart. From here, I can assign a work area from any of the position nodes. So although I already created a work area by default from the Senior VP of Sales, I could assign other work areas that are under it, from one of the managers and their reports, for example. So if I click on the node menu for the VP of Account Management, I can choose Assign Work Area. Follow the same steps as before. So I'll assign it to Dima Johnson, since this organization reports to her. And now from the Scenario Management page, the VP of Account Management work area appears under those assigned by me on this page. So one last thing before we move on. To get started on a work area assigned to me, or to see the work that's been done within one, I'll need to open up their org chart. To do this, I'll click on Load. And as you can see, the work area opens up as an org chart. If I go back to the Target tab, I can see that I set a target for this scenario to decrease headcount in this organization by 15 to 20%. So back in the Overview tab, in the work area for the Senior VP of Sales, I can specifically see that if I want to meet my target, my headcount in sales should be in this range. But the current value is yellow, and according to my target settings, this means that I'm over that range. So I'll load the org chart for the scenario by clicking on the Load button. For the most part, the scenario's org chart functions just as the regular one does, so I can drag to move it around, zoom in and out, and change its style, perspective, and view from the Actions menu. To meet my target, I would have to remove employees from this organization, and one of the ways to do this is by delimiting them. When you delimit an object in Nakisa Hanelly, it will no longer be active past the scenario's key date, or when the scenario comes into effect. So what this means is that the position or employee will no longer be part of the current structure of the organization, but you'll still be able to access this data by going through your records, so by using effective dates, for example. Delimiting is also different from deleting. Anything that is brought into your scenario from your source data can only be delimited, but you can delete any objects you create within the scenario itself. I'll get into this in a little more detail in another capsule. So just to quickly review, when you delimit an employee, you're removing the person from your organization. But when you're delimiting a position, you're removing the position, not its incumbent if it has one. So let's just take a look at the org chart here. If I wanted to delimit this employee, I would click on the node menu here, select Delimit Employee, click on Delimit, and as you can see, the employee node is now crossed out, and the employee no longer appears as an incumbent to the position above it. This is one way I could reduce headcount, and I would repeat the same steps for other employees until I reach my scenario's target. If I wanted to delimit a position, though, I would first have to make sure that it has no incumbent. This is to avoid ending up with orphaned employee nodes. So after making sure that my position node has no incumbent, I would follow the same steps as I did before to delimit it and remove it from my organization. I'll do this by clicking on its node menu, then on Delimit Position, confirm the action, and as you can see, the position is now crossed out. Just as a last point here, I also have the option to undo delimiting. I would just click on the node menu for a delimited object, click on Undo Delimit, and as you can see, this reactivates the object. So far, I've been showing you how to handle different scenario activities, all from the perspective of a single user. But realistically, different portions of a scenario would be assigned to different users, and you might even have multiple people on the same work area. After performing all the necessary tasks within a scenario, I need to verify that the target has been met. I'll just reopen the scenario management page to make sure that it shows me the latest information from all the changes I made. And as you can see in the work area panel over here for Senior VP of Sales, the current value associated to my target is now green and falls within the range that was set earlier. This means that I met my target for this work area and that it's ready to be finalized. Each user assigned to a work area has the Set as Finalized button that you see over here, which indicates that they have finished their portion of the work. The user who assigned the work area, so Mark Johnson in this case, would then be able to finalize it themselves if they're also assigned to the work area. Once all users have finalized the work area, the creator can then load the org chart and review the changes that were made, and either click on Reopen to send the work area back to users for review and changes, or click on Set as Approved. At this point, the creator has the option to reject model, as you can see here, which simply jumps back a step, allowing for more work to be done. Once all the work areas in the scenario have been finalized and approved, the scenario can then be completed from the scenario properties by clicking on the Set as Completed button. This sets the scenario's status as completed. At this point, though, the creator could reopen the scenario by clicking on the button here, if ever updates or changes are needed.